Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Civic Forum. My name is Rory Truex. I'm an associate professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton, and I'm just so excited to see people here today to talk a little bit about democracy. I started this initiative mostly just as a concerned American citizen, and thank you all for coming. I really do appreciate the support. The goal for today is really just to tell you a little bit about the forum and what we're trying to do over the next several sessions, and give you a little mini lecture on the process of democratic backsliding, which is the process through which democratic countries become authoritarian. I wanted to give a shout out to Grace Hsu, who is a former student of mine who did a lot of the graphic design for the program, and Brooke Bothner, who is a student at Swarthmore, who's working with me on the forum as well, and Victor Rolfe, who designed the website for the forum and did a great job in Squarespace. If you're looking for someone to design a website, I would recommend Victor. But in terms of just what we're trying to do today and more broadly throughout most of the sessions, I'm coming at this as a political scientist, but my background is not actually in American politics. I'm a China scholar by trade. And for that reason, I've studied authoritarianism both in China and elsewhere. And like many of you, I'm here today because I'm worried. I'm worried about the state of American democracy. I'm worried about a lot of the anti-democratic behavior we're seeing coming out of Trump and that faction of the GOP that surrounds him. And so the goal for the forum is simply to create a pro-democracy space. This is not a blue or democratic space or a Republican space. It is a pro-democracy space where people from all parts of the ideological spectrum can come and learn a little bit about democracy and hear from speakers and practitioners of democracy. And these are the big three questions that I'm trying to answer. And I don't have all the answers myself. I'm here to learn like you as well, although I will hopefully contribute some background knowledge of political science. But the three big questions we're going to try to answer in the 10 to 12 weeks are: what are the strengths and weaknesses of the US and American democracy in this moment and standing up to the challenge posed by Trump? What are the factors that have contributed to erosion in the United States of democracy? And how importantly, this third question, I think, is the one on many people's minds, is what can normal people do to preserve and protect democracy in this country? What do we know about effective opposition, protest, civic engagement? How can citizens stand up to leadership that they know is fundamentally authoritarian in nature? So those are the three big questions. And I would say that in terms of our philosophy, this is not cable news. You're not going to hear, hopefully, a lot of hot takes or arguing or punditry. This is more of a scholarly and educational endeavor, and the tone will be reflected as such. So I will try to liven it up. I'm not really built for cable news or for TV, but I will try to keep you engaged. This is reminding me a little bit of Zoom teaching, to be honest with you. Only on Zoom, it was during COVID and it was sort of involuntary and nobody really liked it. You're here by choice and I'm here by choice. So hopefully it can be more engaging that way. So in terms of the sessions themselves, in general, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a speaker every week and prominent scholars and practitioners of democracy, and the flow will be as follows. They will present for 10 to 15 minutes, then I will interview them, and then we will move on to Q&A from you all. Crowdcast has really awesome Q&A functions, really good webinar functionality, so we're going to take advantage of that. So that will be the normal flow, but for today, it's just me. I didn't know if anybody was actually going to come. I'm delighted to see you all here. And so I thought today I would just give you a short lecture on democratic backsliding, what we know in political science about this political phenomenon. And then I will introduce the forum and we can do some Q&A that way. So today will feel a little bit less like a conversation and more a little bit like a class, that political science class that maybe you remember fondly or maybe never took. That's what we're going for today. So without further ado, I would normally, if I were teaching in class, I would say, how's morale? How are we feeling? And I would be able to see either smiling faces or bored faces. I cannot see your faces, but if you're feeling good and feeling excited, please let me know in the chat. That would be appreciated. Okay, so I'm going to move myself off to the side a little bit here so you can see the slides a little bit better. So I want to start by just giving you a little bit of a big picture tour of democracy worldwide. So where are we at right now and how are we thinking about the state of democracy in the world? In political science, there's a whole cottage industry of people who are trying to explain and understand different forms of government, and people produce typologies that classify different types of government. And there's no one right way of doing this, but one commonly accepted practice is to classify governments as more or less democratic. And the big node in that decision tree is the presence or absence of free and contested elections. And by free and contested, we mean that voters are able to have free choice. The elections have multiple candidates running, voters are free from coercion, and the results are honored. And if we have all of those things happening, which we do in a lot of places, most of the time, including the United States, that puts us in the democratic world. And then political scientists will also make a distinction between liberal democracy and electoral democracy. I don't love these labels. Liberal democracy, by liberal, we don't mean liberal in the liberal conservative sense. We mean liberal in the kind of philosophical sense, a democracy that honors people's individuality and their rights, and also features checks and balances. So these are sometimes called full democracies. And then countries that have elections, pretty good elections, but nevertheless fall short of granting, full freedom of speech, freedom of association. Maybe they don't have good checks and balances. Those we would call electoral democracies, sometimes incomplete or impartial democracies. But nevertheless, that's the kind of democratic wing. And then on the other side of the ledger, we have authoritarianism. So authoritarianism, people kind of know it when they see it, but in political science, we define it almost as a residual category. These are governments that do not have free and fair elections. If you fail to meet that criteria, you are authoritarian. Often when we think of authoritarian regimes, we watch them on TV, watch these old shows about monarchies. We are thinking about what are called closed authoritarian regimes. That's almost what comes to mind for a lot of people. Closed authoritarian regimes are regimes that do not even bother really with elections or opposition parties at all. The archetypal modern example of this is the PRC, the People's Republic of China. The DPRK, North Korea would also be considered that as well. These are countries where they might have some elections, but Xi Jinping, for example, is not facing any real electoral competition, even from a weak opposition party. So those are closed authoritarian systems. Those are in some sense the most pure form of authoritarianism. But the form of government I want to talk about a lot today is this sort of muddy middle category called electoral authoritarianism, sometimes called competitive authoritarianism. These are countries where there are elections and parties that oppose the government, but the ruling party and the leader, which we would refer to as a dictator, is using the powers of the government to have an unfair advantage over the electoral process. So people vote, other parties run and even campaign, but the electoral playing field is so tilted and imbalanced, be it gerrymandering or coercion, intimidation, control of the press, propaganda, that the elections are really not free and fair in a meaningful way. And so these systems are often the product of backsliding. Once healthy democracies become captured by authoritarian political figures working through the democratic institutions, and we see this kind of distortion of democracy and a kind of collapse towards electoral autocracy. So that is the process at a very abstract level that political scientists and many American citizens are now worried is unfolding currently in the United States. Is the US backsliding towards some form of authoritarian government? I should say I don't love the word backsliding because it implies moving backward. And for a country like the US, which does not have a strong authoritarian political tradition, it doesn't quite make sense to people. What are we sliding back towards? And also sounds like slip and slide, which is fun. Backsliding is not fun. So I often use the phrase democratic erosion or breakdown, which I think is more understandable for people. This is a big old slide of data, and it's one of those charts that you should spend 10 minutes looking at, and I will only give you a couple, but I will break it down for you. This is just looking at the world over time, these 4 different types over time. The data gets a little funky as we get earlier in history. You'll see this large jump in 1900. That's because the data included more countries and cases at that time. So I don't want you to get too bogged down in that. But I did want to highlight a few big trends. The first is that we are in the midst of a global democratic recession. And by that, I mean that the quantity and quality of democracy has been in decline globally for about 10 years now. And this is in sharp contrast to earlier periods of history. If we look earlier, for example, in after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we saw this explosion of democracy in the 1990s. This was the period where Fukuyama and others were writing about the end of history, this idea that democracy is sort of the only viable form of government. Authoritarianism is on the back foot and democracy will eventually spread worldwide. So that was an earlier ethos. And now we are thinking as political scientists and as global citizens about how democracy is actually on the back foot in many countries. And once healthy democracies, including the United States, seem to be stumbling, and there's an inherent fragility to this political system that is noteworthy. The other couple trends I wanted to highlight for you is that authoritarianism itself is changing, and this is in some sense a positive development. We've seen the decline in closed autocracies. So these countries that don't have any opposition, that kind of iron fist, classic Maoist, Stalinist, like that sort of authoritarian regime is in decline. And in its place, we have these sort of murky middle authoritarian governments, which claim to be democratic, have elections, but fundamentally rule in an authoritarian fashion. But it is slightly softer, I would say, than closed authoritarianism. Another way to see this trend is this is that same chart, this time just looking at change. Again, the total number of countries over time. That ugly brown color in the middle are countries that are basically staying the same. The red is countries that are experiencing some measurable degree of autocratization. That doesn't mean they are becoming authoritarian, but that they are trending in that direction for a sustained period of time. And then the blue is countries that are democratizing. And so this is a really nice way of seeing those moments of political optimism and pessimism worldwide, right? So after World War II, we see a real explosion of democracy in much of the developing world. Certainly we see that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and much of the post-communist world becomes democratic. And then now we're seeing the opposite trend, where a lot of democratizing countries are falling prey to backsliding. So that's what we're going to talk about in this series, democratic erosion, and we're going to be focusing quite a lot on the United States. So factors that increase backsliding. What do we know about what makes countries vulnerable to this? One thing I do want to emphasize to you all is that there is no one story. There's no one size fits all solution. Backsliding looks different in every single country, and governments do different things, use different tools, and it takes different forms everywhere. So when people draw historical parallels, for example, to fascist regimes like in Italy or Nazi Germany, those are fine. These are examples of backsliding, but it's important to remember that nobody thinks we're headed down the path of Nazi Germany. So it's always important to remember the unique nature of each case and our own political circumstance. But nevertheless, there are a few things that we think generally make countries more vulnerable to this political process, and I will highlight a few of them. The first is polarization, whether it's partisan or sometimes racial and ethnic polarization. Partisan polarization is simply the degree to which people loathe the other side. So can we coexist with people from the other political parties, or do we see them as competitors, or do we see them as enemies? And the reason why this matters for backsliding is because democracy, we often think about democracy as a repeated game that political parties and politicians agree to play indefinitely, right? And so the idea is that, okay, I'm going to run for election. If I lose, I will give up power, knowing that when I'm not in power, you're not going to throw me in jail. I can stomach your policies, and I will have a chance to compete again in 4 years or 2 years or wherever the next election is. What polarization does is it basically raises the stakes of the game. And when the stakes of the game get high, people have an incentive to cheat. They have an incentive to try to change the rules or just not even honor the results of an election at all. And so polarization creates a political incentive to erode democracy and seize power, full stop. And we can talk about what that looks like in the US. Relatedly, we know that inequality is bad for democracy. Inequality, we typically think in political science, when a country gets highly unequal, it creates a class of people, the hyper wealthy, that have an incentive often to fight against democracy. This is not uniformly true, and there are plenty of very wealthy people who are very pro-democracy. But in general, when people are highly wealthy, they fear democracy because democracy empowers the common person, which, if done right, would entail a high degree of redistribution of wealth from the hyper wealthy down to the middle class and the poor. And so high levels of inequality create an incentive to engage in authoritarian behavior, especially among the hyper rich. We get kind of a grievance politics from the working class that can be used to justify authoritarian moves as well. So inequality is not good for democracy. Sue Stokes, who's a legendary political scientist and has a new book on backsliding, she's joining the forum in a few weeks. she has a new book coming out on this, and she gave a talk at Princeton a few months ago, and she had a nice sentence, which I'm going to butcher, which was basically like, investing in reducing inequality is like investing in democracy itself. And so I think that's one thing to think about. The other couple of factors, and then I'll move on, is an authoritarian political tradition, right? So a lot of times we observe backsliding when countries are just newly institutionalized democracies. Democracy is like a plant. It needs to take root, and politicians need to understand power one to one another. It needs to become commonplace and normal for a country to go between different governments. And the longer the democratic tradition is, the deeper those roots take hold, and civil society grows, media grows, all the kind of ancillary institutions and societal checks and balances start to take hold. And that is a huge stabilizing force. A lot of times we see backsliding. We see a lot of it, for example, in Latin America, which has a history of military dictatorships and coups. We see a lot of it in post-communist countries, which are obviously coming out of the Soviet Union and that political experience. And so countries that have a long tradition of democracy tend to fare better. And then the final factor I would raise is national security threats. Basically, any government can manufacture a national security threat if they want. But what I'm talking about here is countries that are faced with war or the prospect of war, countries that are faced with some internal instability, whether it's a migrant population or some population inside that is creating instability or creating the perception of instability. Authoritarian governments or backsliding leaders feed on threats and national security threats to justify authoritarian turns in their countries. And so that's another key ingredient in this mix. So we're at 20 minutes in. I hope you're doing all right. I cannot tell if you're still with me. Again, this reminds me of Zoom teaching. I will tell you a quick aside. When I was teaching my Chinese politics course many years ago during Zoom, I had a student. We could see their faces while they were taking the class. And so I would be lecturing and watching them on Zoom. And I had a student who was lying in her childhood bed because everybody was at home. And I watched her fall asleep during my lecture and then continue to sleep through it with the camera on. So that was just mortifying as a teacher. It really scarred me. And it was probably one of the worst lectures after that because I couldn't get over it. So maybe it's good that I can't see what you're doing. But I assume you're with me and you're engaged and excited. And I'm going to keep going. And then we'll get to Q&A. So quickly, case studies. There are many, many cases. So depending on who you talk to, there are roughly 25 to 30 different countries that are experiencing backsliding in the last 2 decades. And we can go down the list: Hungary, Turkey, Russia, Brazil, El Salvador, Ecuador, Poland, United States, Israel, many, many different examples. I'm going to pick 2 that are in the headlines because there are direct ties between these governments and the GOP. And in fact, both of these leaders that I'm going to mention have been invited to CPAC and have very strong relationships directly with the Trump administration. And so some of their tactics we're seeing actually replicated by the Trump administration. There's actually seems to be like a transnational coalition of this style of leader that I think is noteworthy. And so Hungary, this is not my area of study. We are going to be joined in a few weeks by Kim Shepley, who is my dear colleague at Princeton. She is one of the country's leading experts on Hungary, and she's going to do a whole session on this. So I will just give you the highlights. Viktor Orban, we often think of as an example of someone who used what's called constitutional hardball to erode democracy in his country. So he did things legally, but he gained power and then used the power of his office to fundamentally erode the quality of democracy in his country in the name of his political coalition. So Orban is an interesting character. You should read up a little bit more about him if you're interested. He originally was a kind of a young liberal. His party, the Fidesz party, was in power prior to 2010 as a quasi-liberal party, but they lost power, and he remade himself as kind of this nationalist, traditional conservative, anti-EU, anti-globalist conservative. And they won a majority of the vote in 2010 after the financial crisis. They won 52% of the vote, but by virtue of the Hungarian constitution, that gave them 68% of seats, which meant they had a constitutional supermajority, meaning they could amend and rewrite the constitution at will without any input from any opposition party. Anytime a government is able to rewrite the constitution without any checks whatsoever, this is dangerous. We are actually lucky that in the United States, it is very difficult to change the Constitution. That is a good thing for political stability. So Orban is able to change the constitution, and they rewrite a new one a year later with basically no input from the opposition. The new constitution does a lot of different things. Notably, it forces retirement, and the amendments to it, it forces the retirement of over 200 judges because of a retirement age change. And a new judicial office is created that is packed with Orban loyalists, and they oversee judicial appointments to the tune. And so basically, there's court packing. This is what Levitsky and Ziblatt call changing the referees or sidelining the referees. The other big thing it did is that it made the way for gerrymandering and halved the number of parliamentary seats and created a new electoral commission, again, staffed by Orban's loyalists. And they gerrymandered the districts and created kind of a locked-in electoral advantage for the foreseeable future. The way we see this manifest itself is 4 years later, they won less than 50% of the vote in the parliamentary election, but maintained the same seat share. So they basically changed the constitution such that they will always have this kind of advantage. Other things that are notable, we'll talk more about them later in the season, is the attack on higher education. So Central European University, which has ties to George Soros, was forced to relocate to Vienna. Gender studies was banned in universities. So there was this effort to attack higher education and curb dissent in those institutions. The media, which in Hungary is largely state-owned public media, kind of like a BBC or an NPR, became basically dominated by Orban and his loyalists and became almost a propaganda outlet for Fidesz. And campaign spending was limited, which meant that the opposition parties which didn't have access to state media were at this kind of locked-in disadvantage. And so I could go on, and we will go on in great detail with Kim, but the thing I want to highlight here is that this is one blueprint for backsliding, which is using the power granted by a democratically elected office to erode democracy from within and cement an electoral advantage. Okay, second case is Nayib Bukele. Bukele is an interesting figure. He is a millennial with two small children. So he's of my generation. He's exceedingly popular in El Salvador. If you go online, like on YouTube, and look up videos of Bukele, and a lot of them talk about backsliding, you will see comments from people from El Salvador saying, this man is beloved in this country. And by all accounts, he is. He won re-election with 85% of the vote and has 80 to 90% approval ratings. And he's accomplished important things for his country, and I think it's important to say that. But at the same time, his style of governance is, in my opinion, fundamentally authoritarian and has eroded the quality of democracy in that country. So just quickly, Bukele is the example of someone who's using emergency powers in order to justify a power grab and the erosion of human rights. So it's quite a different mechanism, but with the same sort of outcome. He came into office in 2019, and his party years later won a supermajority in the legislative elections. And very quickly, again, we see court packing. So the assembly removes 5 constitutional court judges, and Bukele replaces them with his loyalists. And then a couple months later, there's an amendment basically that allows Bukele to run for another term, which previously had been prohibited by the Constitution. So anytime we see somebody messing with term limits in order to stay in power, we see threats of that from people in the Trump administration. We see legislation in Congress to give Trump a third term. We saw that in China. Xi Jinping got rid of term limits. Term limits are a huge democratic guardrail, and anybody that erodes them, that's generally a sign of backsliding behavior, people that are changing the rules. But the way we think about Bukele more importantly is that he did use this state of emergency to suspend civil liberties. So there's a large amount of gang violence in El Salvador. It's one of the most violent countries in the world. And after some gang violence in 2022, he declared a state of exemption, which is basically a state of emergency. And he suspended civil liberties. This was only supposed to last 1 month. And it's been continuously renewed for, I think, over 30 times now, 30 additional months. And so it's a state of emergency that never seems to stop. And in that period of time, he arrested 70,000 people. Some people say 85,000 people, roughly 1% of the population of El Salvador, targeting people who are affiliated with gang activity. And so this is why he's popular, is because he's a law and order guy in a country that was riddled with violence. But the way it's been done, there are widespread accusations of human rights abuses. You've probably seen images of those prisons where people are being treated basically like animals. And the process, there are trials, the kind of right to legal defense, all of that was basically thrown under the carpet. And as you might expect, this has an effect on opposition as well, kind of the intimidation of that type of government. So those are just examples, and I could go through many more, and I am not experts in those countries, and hopefully we'll be able to bring on some other experts. But I did want to spend a few minutes just talking about the US. So where are we in the US? There's this kind of debate in political science of, is the US authoritarian already, or are we still democratic? I think this is the wrong debate to be having. I think the debate should be like, how do we understand the modern GOP? And I want to say outright that a lot of times people will say, oh, well, you're calling them authoritarian because you're liberal and it's sour grapes, and you're upset that you're not in power. And so you're using the language of authoritarianism to discredit them. I will say two things very clearly. One, this is a government that was elected in free and fair elections. That is important for people to acknowledge. And then the second thing is there's a distinction between conservative government and authoritarian government. And conservative government is enacting conservative policies through democratic practices. Authoritarian government is eroding the core institutions of democracy in order to enact whatever policies they want. And so that's the distinction I'm trying to make here. I'm not upset because Trump is conservative. I'm upset and concerned because he's authoritarian. And so the language I've been trying to use and write about is this idea of him as a proto-autocrat, like protozoa, like a primordial, early stage autocrat, someone who clearly has authoritarian ambitions and is on that path. And so early stage backslider. And the formal definition here, I say democratically elected leader that has demonstrated through their behavior the intention to transition the country to authoritarianism by compromising the integrity of the electoral process, period. So this is probably the biggest claim I will make on this session today. If you're here, you probably maybe agree with that, or maybe you're thinking in these terms already. But let me be very clear about why I believe the GOP and the faction of the GOP that supports Trump is fundamentally authoritarian in nature. And the easiest test is how they reacted to the 2020 election. So in this book, I brought a book here, which you should all read if you're looking for some not light, but important summer reading. This is Tyranny of the Minority by Levitsky and Ziblatt. It's their follow-up to How Democracies Die. And they talk about, in this book, they have a whole chapter about what it means to be a democratic political party, a pro-democracy political party, and what it means to be an authoritarian political party. And a big part of this is, how do you react when you lose? And so is Trump and the GOP authoritarian? Well, they lost an election in 2020 that was by all accounts free and fair with minimal levels of fraud, and tried to overturn those results, period. And I recently read this report from Jack Smith that came out in January of 2025. I would encourage you as American citizens, here's some text from the report. I would encourage you to read the whole thing. And it goes in great detail about the behavior of Trump and those around him in that period between November and January, immediately after the election. And people often fixate on January 6th, which was, of course, the kind of most visible assault on democracy. I actually think that's a little bit of a mistake, because it gives Trump and those around him the excuse to say, oh, well, we can't be accountable for the behavior of our supporters. So obviously that was a huge part, and his role in fomenting that insurrection, I think, is important. But I actually think we should continue to pay attention to everything he did in November and December, which people often forget, calling up people, asking them to find a certain number of votes in Georgia, putting pressure on people to send alternative slates of electors, and so on and so forth. So these are people that attempted to steal an election. That is quite literally the most authoritarian thing you can do. And we can talk about all the other aspects of Trump that are authoritarian in nature, the cult of personality, the inability, the kind of tenuous relationship with truth, the willingness to lie basically at will, the endemic corruption, the cozying up to violent political actors, the use of violent threats against the opposition. These are all things that are anti-democratic in nature. The lack of respect for the rule of law, the willingness to bend the rules, the willingness to treat the political opposition as an enemy and vilify them as such, on and on and on. These are core features of an authoritarian political movement. But to me, the thing I will always go back to is how they acted in this moment. And importantly, how everybody else in the GOP acted, with few exceptions, right? So this is someone who tried to steal an election. And rather than hold this person accountable, most GOP officials and leaders went along with it. And eventually they came to repeat his lie, the big lie that he had won the 2020 election. And the few people like Liz Cheney and others that stood up and were fundamentally loyal to democracy, paid an enormous price in terms of their political careers and even just their personal safety in the violent events that they've experienced. And so, in my opinion, any government official, any Republican office holder who has not fully condemned the behavior of 2020 in the fall when Trump tried to overturn the results of an election is authoritarian and is complicit with what is going on. So that's my little rant. I apologize. That was probably the most emotional you'll get. You'll see me. So then there's this question of, well, how do we make sense of everything that's going on? And I think in those initial 5 to 6 months, there was just so much that was happening. There's this kind of body blows to democracy over and over and over again. It was difficult to make sense of it all. And so what I try to do just on this slide is put things in buckets for people to see how it all fits together. And these are time-honored patterns in backsliding. So these types of leaders generally do three things. They attack the opposition and try to erode electoral competition by changing the rules. They try to attack civil society, whether that's the media, nonprofits, universities, any outside actors that would be critical of them. They try to discredit, defund, attack, make their lives difficult. And then they try to engage in executive aggrandizement, right? So they elevate the power of the executive. They willingly relinquish partisan allies, like in Congress, for example, will willingly relinquish their own power to the executive and erode the checks and balances in the system. And so we've seen, I'm not going to go through all of these actions. You're probably familiar with most of them. And this is an incomplete list, right? Things are unfolding on the day-to-day. But collectively, this is what it's looking like. And these are authoritarian political behavior. The other thing I would note is that authoritarian actors rarely describe themselves as such, right? So Orban called himself, he wanted to create an illiberal state in Hungary, but he's sort of the exception. Nobody in the Republican Party is saying, yeah, we're authoritarian, we're behind Trump, we're going to erode democracy. They are using pretext to do all of these things. And it's important to understand them as pretext, right? So there's an executive order requiring proof of citizenship to vote. Because of state level voting rules, it will likely not mean that much. But there's this constant effort to require voting proof of citizenship to vote and other things, which actually many other countries have. It's kind of a sensible policy. But we know that in the US, 10% of the population does not have federal ID. And it's disproportionately people who are poor and people of color. And so this would wind up being a discriminatory measure. We know that this would differentially hurt the Democrats. That's why the Republicans want to do it. And it's being done on the pretext of voter fraud, which is something Trump and others around him have been crying for years, and there's not widespread evidence of voter fraud. And so that's just one pretext. Another pretext is, what happened at Harvard, where Harvard is being destroyed. The country's preeminent research institution is being destroyed because on the grounds of it's in the name of fighting anti-Semitism and fighting the China threat and so on and so forth, and fighting DEI. Those are the pretexts. In reality, we know that prior to coming into office, J.D. Vance, among others, called universities the enemy. He said they needed to be taken down a peg. And this is exactly what Orban did in Hungary. So that's another pretext. So there's an ambiguity to these moves. Every single one of them is being justified, is being glossed over, but collectively they amount to an assault on democracy. And that's a theme I wanted to leave you. I'm going to close because I see so many good questions and I've just been blabbing and I would love to interact with you more. But just this big question of, can it happen here? The answer is yes, right? We have a long tradition of democracy, but we have some of these other factors in our society now that are really concerning. And I will go through a few. So partisan polarization, this is probably not news to you all, but partisan polarization in the United States is extraordinarily high. And it's been high for about a decade now, a little bit longer than that. This is data from the ANES, which is a public opinion survey that's used by political scientists. The cool thing about it is it's been asking the same questions for decades, so we can compare different periods of time. Polarization is the way we measure in our field is the difference between how you feel about your own party and how you feel about the other party. So if you hate your own party and the other party, you're actually not that polarized. You just hate everybody. But if you really love your party and really loathe the other one, you're highly polarized. And so we've seen polarization increase over time, in particular, that kind of out-group loathing. The feelings toward the rival party have really increased in recent years. And that predated Trump. It was increasing under Obama and under Bush as well. But we have high degree of polarization. The other thing that's working against us is we have extraordinarily high levels of inequality in this country. There's so much data on this. This is data from Piketty and Saez, which look at the income share of the top 10%. The top 10% of people in the United States, goes back to 2012, it's increased since then, have over 50% of the income in this country, which is not healthy. It creates incentives for authoritarianism among the hyper elite. It also creates kind of resentment politics that can be activated by a kind of a demagogue like Trump. And so the inequality is concerning and bad for our democracy. And then the national security threats, this country, there's many threats being activated at the same time, right? There's the China threat, there's the immigrant crime threat, there's the terrorism threat from the Middle East, Palestine, Iran, all you name it. They're all kind of intertwining. And again, these create a pretext for engaging in power grabs and other forms of intimidation. I'm actually quite optimistic, despite the tone of this first part of this. And the reason why I'm optimistic is this third one. It's the democratic tradition. This isn't Hungary. This isn't Brazil. This isn't Turkey. And that's not to denigrate those societies and those countries. But there is something unique about the United States. We have a deep, deep democratic tradition. And I've been really heartened and inspired by the level of activism in this country. And it is significant. People say, oh, do all these protests mean anything? Yes, they do. Protests normalize opposition. They create conversations at dinner tables and in hometowns, and they generate a popular consciousness about what is going on. The language of authoritarianism is now mainstream. I'm not the only person saying Trump is authoritarian. Millions of people are saying that. And that is significant. The No Kings protest, according to data from Elliot Morris, who used to run 538, I think had roughly 1.5 to 2.5% of the population. I have to fact check this, but I think it's about 2% of the population participated on a protest on that day. That is an unbelievable number. It would mark it as the second largest protest in American history. So that is significant. And there's other data on this as well. This is, again, data from Elliot, and we see the number of protests over time comparing the Trump administration term 1 to term 2. People are out in the streets a lot more in term 2 than they were in term 1. And that does matter. And so I don't want this to be somber, defeated type of forum. I do think there is reason for optimism. We are in the middle of a contest for our democracy itself, but there are reasons for optimism, and I do share that optimism. So I'm going to just say 2 minutes, and then I will do Q&A. So this forum, we have an awesome lineup. Really, I'm so honored by the people that have agreed to participate. Some of the top scholars and practitioners of democracy. I'm just going to highlight a few different people that are coming up. Kianga Yamada-Taylor is a colleague of mine at Princeton, also lives in Philadelphia. She's one of the leading scholars on race in the United States, and she's going to give a talk, and we'll have a conversation next week about the relationship between Black history and MAGA. Mark Beisinger is another colleague of mine. He's one of the country's leading experts on Russia, and he'll be able to talk about US-Russia relations and Ukraine and Putin, Trump. And strongman Ruth Ben-Ghiat is pretty darn famous now, and she's coming to talk with me, which I'm so honored by. She is famous for studying fascism in Italy and Germany, and she's written this book, Strongmen, which is about this style of government. And then the week after, we have Erica Chenoweth. Erica is famous for their study of civic engagement, protest, and what it takes for movements to be effective. And so we're going to learn from Erica about what effective opposition looks like. And then there are many other sessions as well. I will plug those later on in the season. But this is a really, really exciting group of people. I'm excited to have these conversations. So really quickly, people have asked me, is this free? Do I need to pay? I do not need to pay. I do not want or need your money. I am honored by your presence. And so the best way to support this work is to spread the news. Please spread the word. I would ask you to try to share news about this forum with 5 other people. If you can do that for me, I would be grateful for that. The other thing I want to note is that this is just me. This is not a Princeton initiative. I am not using my university resources, Zoom, anything like that for this. This is just me on my own. It has nothing to do with my research and teaching at Princeton. And if you want to connect with me, you can reach me at my email, rtruex@princeton.edu. I will leave it there for today. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really honored by your presence, and I do hope you come again next week, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much.